So we arrive today to learn together, and we leave today to work together with the communities that these students are absolutely deeply committed to serving with you all in the future. And we thank you for that and hope for a great day of conversations. With that, I leave you in the hands of 3 of our students. Sharad, Lauren, and Maddie will now take the podium. Thank you all.
Hi everyone. First, we wanted to note that in order to allow those who couldn't join us in person to enjoy the conversation, and also for CLE purposes, this event is being recorded and live streamed. If you have any questions about this, please speak with Kanisha Askew or another TPIC staff person. But we also wanted as students to acknowledge some people that we're very grateful for making this symposium come together. We, the class of 2021 Toll Scholars and Fellows, could not have planned this event without the support of many amazing individuals and organizations. First, we'd like to thank our incredible panelists for agreeing to be a part of this symposium and for participating in these meaningful and important conversations. We'd like to thank Dean Ruger, Dean Lin, and Dimitri Islam for the institutional support they have provided.
We are also thankful to Kathleen Sanat and the entire facilities team for all the assistance in providing the space and necessities for the symposium. We are also thankful to Lisa Deere and the entire communications office for creating our wonderful marketing and publicity materials, as well as the Penn Law ITS for the technical support throughout the day. We are thankful to the class of 2020's Toll Scholars for all their guidance and sage advice throughout the process. We are also thankful to the whole Penn Law Service Corps for serving as a sounding board as we brainstorm topics for the symposium, as well as for your willingness to volunteer and to help with the event and participate in the process.
Finally, and most importantly, we want to thank the team at TPIC, especially Kanisha, who worked tirelessly with us to plan this symposium while always maintaining a smile and a positive attitude. This event could not have happened without her at all. We would also like to thank Emily Sutcliffe for her big picture vision and for always keeping us grounded and focused, Victoria Gillison for her support in bringing the symposium together, and Kelsey Ulam for her exhaustive logistical support. And of course, we would like to thank Arlene Rivera-Finkelstein, whose willingness to mentor and listen to us has invariably shaped our career paths and our personal lives for the better. Thank you.
And I think we'd like to invite our first panelist to come up now. So I'd like to welcome you all to our first panel of the day, organized by myself and Lily Davis and Sherrod Smith. This panel is called Breaking Down Barriers, Ensuring the Promise of Healthy, Affordable Homes. On this panel, we feature a group of practitioners, organizers, and scholars who employ a variety of methods in the struggle for housing justice in Philadelphia. To begin this discussion, we're going to play a brief excerpt from the documentary Dream Deferred PHL, that highlights the displacement of the Black Bottom in West Philadelphia. As we gather here in University City to discuss housing justice, we must acknowledge this university's relationship with the surrounding area, and we hope this video will prompt us all to consider this history and ground the discussion. And just a note about questions, we're going to hold all questions to the end. If you'd like to submit a question, please grab a note card from Haley, who's here in the front, and we're going to present the questions to the panelists around 10:30.
Redlining was one major component of sort of dismantling the economic opportunities for immigrants and people of color.
So one of my earliest memories is growing up in the Black Bottom on Phillips, 33rd and Phillips. We had a small house, shared kitchen, and working class. But I do remember an intact family. Most people had a mother and a father. And my father was a jazz musician. So they rehearsed over our house, and people used to stand outside our window and listen to my father and then play. I remember people in the neighborhood coming together on Saturday to clean the block. You put the Ajax on the step, and then you have a bucket of hot water, and you have the scrub brush, and you just scrubbing steps down, literally. You just scrubbing the steps down. And most people outside doing the same and sweeping. I thought it was such a pain. Drexel was an institute at the time, right? So it's not even a college. When we was real little, we would go across Market, the University of Penn's campus, and be playing in the grass. You know, emotionally, I felt safe. I felt safe in the body.
Working middle-class African Americans being pushed farther out of those boundaries. My grandparents actually lived around 39th and Aspen, pushed out of a space that they had made their home.
I remember adults talking and being angry. People had to leave. People offered money, and if you were renting, you hopefully that your landlord told you what was up.
We ended up moving out to Parkside, and so this is long before I was around.
My father's job changed. He was the first black truck driver for Smithsville. Economically, we started doing better. So we moved to 59th and Pines. We also looked at it as a step up. It seemed like further west, the houses were more separated, bigger, stuff like that. Streets were much more wider. We moved up 1960. We were one of like third and fourth black families. It wasn't like no welcoming brigade when we got to Pines. Within 3 years, white people were gone. They broke out.
I'm an 80s baby, so I remember going to 60th and Market to do Saturday shopping. And sometimes that was just getting basic goods for the home. There was stores everywhere. Any parent or shopkeeper that said hello to my aunt was allowed to say hello to me, was allowed to also direct me. You know, that was home.
I'm coming home. Emotionally and spiritually means something. And who gets to have sacred space? There's a lot in a home, right, in a house. And people getting connected to an area, a community, a neighborhood.
It's really interesting to see how that 60th Street corridor has really changed over time. And you've seen a lot of disinvestment. You've seen a lot of blight due to businesses not being able to survive economically. In 2008 was the recession, and then the SEPTA L project. Construction there was slated to take about 3 years, took almost double the time. You know, you really lost all of that foot traffic, compounded by the loss of home ownership. There is sort of this slow mourning process of watching that business that, you know, has been owned by someone who lives in the community or has ties to the communities, and to see that it may have been in the family for generations and that they then lose that.
City services changed, right? You know, it used to be 2 garbage trash pickups a week. We broke it down to 1. They used to come around, spray the bugs, stuff like that. They stopped doing that. You take an idea that a group is particularly inferior, and you're not just going to think that, but you're going to set up things to determine what kind of quality food you're going to get, you know, whether your street's going to get fixed, whether you're going to have the street lights, something like that, whether how many cops you're going to have, you know, how much funding you're going to get for the public schools in the area, even when people's salaries start going down and there's no major employee in the area. All these things matter. Human beings are meant to be treated well. And when we don't, no matter what it is, that's when things start going around that area. Gang wars started happening. So that was a major fear factor when people start jumping, beating people up, that internalized oppression. Black people fighting one another for a piece of property that wasn't ours. Youth, who we had a lot of time on our hands. I think our parents was working tough. Most people, it was intact families and everybody was working. And sometimes the lights fall up the dark, we would come, we would just be fighting over who could play on the baseball field, dumb stuff like that. So the area becomes decayed. University City becomes enriched. It's rough around my street down there. To this day, my mom still lives on that block. So eminent domain means it's for the greater good of the city or the commonwealth. Ultimately, is it better that we have University City now, we don't have Black Bottom? Or could we conceive of both of them being in existence for one another? How would it have looked if developers wanted to come to the area called Black Bottom, respected, appreciated, and valued the community that they live in?
There are many assets in the community. There's a relentless spirit of the individuals who live there in the face of systemic disinvestment. Growing up in West Philly, I had a mother who never made more than $22,000 a year. When I look at parents, moms who work 2 and 3 jobs, who are going to community college part-time, they're not lazy. And we're seeing homes for $300,000 in a neighborhood 5 blocks away where the average home cost is around $60,000. And so there's no way for our homeowners to compete with those rising costs. You know, once taxes are assessed, those homeowners will be at risk of losing those properties that they have really cobbled together and tried to hold on for generations. So here we are again, a repeating of that cycle, of that land that was not thought of as valuable, now thought of as valuable, and then using policies, using zoning, using capital, using influence to really help drive another push. Well, 63rd and Market is the line in Delaware County. So how much further can people be pushed out?
Hello, everyone. So to formally start our panel, we'd like to introduce our panelists briefly. Our first panelist is Council Member Kendra Brooks. Kendra Brooks made history when she was elected to an at-large seat on Philadelphia City Council, becoming the first third-party candidate to win a seat in the 100 years since the council adopted a modern legislative structure. Kendra ran on the Independent Working Families Party ticket with fellow organizer Nicholas O'Rourke, who will actually be with us later today, on a platform that centered the interests of low-income Black and brown Philadelphians. Kendra was highly involved in the fight for local control of the School District of Philadelphia and in the fight to end the 10-year tax abatement.
Next, we have Professor Daniel Aldana Cohen. Mr. Cohen is a writer and assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, a hub for critical social science research on the climate crisis that aims to enhance public engagement and inform public policy. Professor Cohen studies urban regions of the North and South, especially New York and Sao Paulo, and conducts qualitative and quantitative research exploring the intersections of climate change, housing, the political economy, social movements, and inequalities of race and social class in the United States and other countries as well. Professor Cohen's writing and research have appeared in Nature, Public Culture, Jacobin, Dissent, the NACLA report on the Americas. He is currently co-editing a special series on the Green New Deal for Jacobin magazine. And next we have Mr. Leonard Dow. Mr. Dow is a native Philadelphian who has dedicated his entire career to serving his community. Mr. Dow currently serves as a stewardship and development specialist for Everence Financial, a Christian financial services organization that helps individuals and communities in urban areas strengthen, sustain, and build their financial capacity. In this role, Mr. Dow travels to different communities to discuss the history of redlining and racially restrictive covenants. Prior to Everence, Mr. Dow served as pastor of Oxford Mennonite Church in Philadelphia for 20 years. While serving as pastor, Mr. Dow founded Oxford Circle Christian Community Development Association, an initiative that organizes community building programs such as GED prep, ESL courses, and workshops on immigration rights and fair housing in order to encourage residents of the changing Oxford community to become more familiar with one another. Mr. Dow has served as bishop for the Philadelphia District of the Lancaster Mennonite Conference, vice chair of the Mennonite Central Committee, U.S., and board chair of the Kingdom Builders Anabaptist Network of Greater Philadelphia.
And then we have Rasheedah Phillips. Rasheedah is a public interest attorney, an artist, writer, and cultural producer based in Philadelphia. Rasheedah is currently the Senior Advocate, Resources, and Training Attorney at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, where she provides strategic support and training to legal services organizations nationwide on issues of community lawyering, racial equity, and affirmative litigation. Prior to her work with the Shriver Center, Rasheedah worked for 10 years with Community Legal Services, ultimately becoming managing attorney of the housing unit. Under Rasheedah's leadership, CLS's housing unit made great strides for Philadelphians, including spearheading the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project, a pilot program to significantly increase protections for vulnerable tenants, laying the foundation for passage of a citywide right to counsel in 2019. Rasheedah is the founder of the Afrofuturist Affair, co-founder of Black Quantum Futurism, founding member of Metropolarity Queer Spec Fic Collective, and co-creator of Community Futures Lab, which incorporates themes of Afrofuturism, gentrification, oral history, and communal memory in the Sharswood neighborhood facing mass displacement and gentrification. So to kick things off, we wanted to pose a question to all of you. Can you tell us what you envision as a healthy, affordable home? Any order?
Okay, I'll start.
Okay.
To me, a healthy, affordable home is a space where we all could co-live. One of the statements came in and said, could we conceive both being in the same space? Mm-hmm. So affordable housing or affordable units should make sure that regardless of socioeconomic status, race, class, we should all be able to live in a community together that's affordable, whether you're making $10,000 or $100,000. You know, our system has been created that just because you made $10,000, you don't have the ability to maintain a beautiful space. And I think that we need to switch that narrative all around, because if we are living together in a communal area, we all have equal opportunity to those green space and safe, healthy buildings, and eliminate blight. And I think that we currently don't look at our system like that. It's really set up based on income.
Thanks. I completely agree with that. I think we should also acknowledge the major affordable housing programs that we have right now, like the home mortgage interest tax deduction, which has been an almost $100 billion affordable housing program for middle and upper class homeowners, mostly white homeowners, throughout the century. We should acknowledge that Penn has been running affordable housing programs like subsidizing homeownership for its employees in West Philadelphia, subsidizing the Penn Alexander School to ensure that the benefits of homeownership and of that neighborhood go specifically to Penn employees and their children to transform this neighborhood. So I think my vision of affordable housing is very different, much more like what Kendra is articulating. It's about protecting working class families and poor families and even lower middle class families from the market, through forms of social housing that are multiracial, multi-class, mixed. And I think we also want to talk about environmental sustainability. So true, healthy, affordable housing is safe from carbon. It's safe from utility costs. Utility costs are the number one reason that people take out payday loans right now. Safe from the ravages of climate change, whether that's flooding or fire or extreme heat that a lot of families can't afford to protect themselves from. So fundamentally, it's about a really decent place to live, connected to the community, not based on race and class, as the affordable housing of the federal government policies, racist policies have been for so long. and it has to fundamentally be about being safe in a world of global warming. I think we can talk a little bit more about housing can actually help us lead the fight against climate change, but in a way that centers justice.
Yeah. I would just seem to be going down this way. When I think about the question of affordable housing, I think about Maslow's law of hierarchy, that at the very basis is shelter, right? And so this understanding of security and safety and access, as my sister mentioned, as well as safe from environmental concerns. But the other author I think about is Luther Vandross, that a house is not a home without love, right? I think I dated myself because half the people weren't born in the 80s. Google it. But the concept of the song is that love is there. It's a sacred place. And though the song is primarily about in that particular home, I think it would be fair to extend that to the community around you. So affordable housing is not only about that home, but it's also about that community. And lastly, from a financial side, I think we think of affordable housing, I think we need to include in that this understanding of it being an asset if it's home ownership compared to rental, and that historically home ownership has been not the only but a key factor in wealth building and wealth transference.
So I don't think I can improve on my panelists, but I would just say, recognizing housing to be the most important stabilizing factor for everything and the most important foundation for individuals and families. I would just say I see it as a place where people thrive, where they can rest, where they can sustain their health, where they can cultivate joy, where they're able to access social networks, community, transportation, art, culture, education, and employment. So.
Thank you for all your observations. And our next question kind of stems and coincides well with the documentary we just watched. Would you all be willing to reflect on the personal observations you all have on how your own neighborhood in Philadelphia has changed throughout the years and some of the trends and different patterns you've seen throughout the past decades?
Sure, maybe I'll begin. I was born at 18th and Glenwood, North Philly section, North Philly in the house. And just reflecting back on that period of time, I'm old enough to remember North Philly, or that particular area of North Philly, as, from my observation as a child, as a thriving community because of we were still in the industrial age and the majority of the factories were in that particular area. So I remember my father, who worked at Botany 500 on Broad in Glenwood, right? Broad, Glenwood. There, being able to walk to work. I was told that I was in the carriage and my mother would take me to Botany 500 for lunch breaks when she wasn't doing her maternity leave. And I remember seeing that community, similar to what the brother was talking about, the bottom here in West Philly, seeing that transition from a very stable community where jobs were plentiful to a community that was inundated with drugs and disinvestment in a relatively short period of time, maybe 10, 15, 20 years from the mid-60s to the 80s. And at that point, it seemed like you had two choices, was to remain and deal with this transitional period of time within the community, and also remember the policing increasing from beat cops to police officers in cars, and this disconnect, them versus us. And those who stayed couldn't move, and those in my family situation who were able to move, we moved out. So there was disinvestment, and to be somewhat transparent, there were those who said for the survival of my family, we also had to transition. So that's when crack cocaine came in. It was not nearly as compassionate as the opioid crisis, so it was policed, and young men that were about my age, most of which were either incarcerated or killed, or et cetera. That's kind of what I remember growing up.
I can jump in real quick. So I live in North Philadelphia. I'm actually originally from Trenton, New Jersey, but I've been living in Philadelphia since I was 14 for about 21 years or so. And so I've lived all over Philadelphia, lived a lot in the Northeast, and then kind of intentionally built my home in North Philadelphia, went to Temple University. And so in that space of, since I've graduated college, which I can't remember when that was, 10 or 15 years ago, that area of North Philadelphia has rapidly gentrified. It looks, it looks very different. It is viscerally different than when I first moved there in the early 2000s. And just having served in that community, lived in that community, I'm very familiar with the history of it, and having done a bunch of projects around there. The Community Futures Lab project that I did involved me going into the archives and really thinking about the history of the neighborhood and the history of housing in the Sharswood and what's now called Brewery Town neighborhood, and having talked to the residents. And much like what my co-panelist was just saying, it used to be a very thriving area. It was a very multi-ethnic, racially diverse area. They had an amazing commercial corridor along Ridge Avenue, along what's now known as Cecil B. Moore Avenue, 22nd Street, all over North Philadelphia, honestly. And so in the 60s, with a lot of the things happening around redlining, around segregation, all these other things, there were a number of there was a race riot, of course, that happened in North Philadelphia, which fundamentally changed the neighborhood. Folks weren't able to come back to that neighborhood and live or start their businesses. And that riot was fundamentally, when you kind of look at the history of that riot, what it was about was the same social issues that we're dealing with today, people not being able to access housing, people not being able to kind of access the employment that they needed to be able to sustain their community and their neighborhoods. So while you hear a lot of things about the riot and what might have sparked it off, at the heart of it, at the base of it was some of the same issues that folks are dealing with today. And so when you look at the demographics of some of those North Philadelphia communities, they have not changed at all. It's really actually disturbing to see that the patterns of segregation, the patterns of disinvestment, the patterns of housing instability look almost exactly the same as like 1964 and 1968. So it's a little disturbing to see that, and again, not as a native Philadelphian, but as someone who's lived in that community for a long time, to now see, this kind of tale of two communities where block by block is different. Block by block, you can have a block of as they alluded to in the video in West Philadelphia, where you have a $300,000, $500,000 property, and then right around the corner, a house valued at $40,000. And we are actively seeing people being pushed out of the neighborhood because of rising property taxes. So it's no longer anecdotal, right? We're actually seeing evidence of this. And another thing I'll just mention quickly is a study released recently by the Urban Institute found that over 12,000 Black families have been pushed out of Philadelphia neighborhoods in the past 20 years or so. Over 12,000. That blows my mind. And if we were anywhere else and being honest about what that is and what we would call that, right? It's almost genocide, right? It's because where are these people? Where do they go? Where do they live? It's disturbing. So anyway, that's kind of my history.
So I was taking notes here as each of my panelists were talking, because I remember 18th and Glenwood, my family's first home coming from the South was at 13th and Clearfield. Right. So that was our first stabilized home in Philadelphia for my family. And then my grandparents moved on up. So we moved up to Nicetown. It was a mixed neighborhood back when my uncles and them lived there. And then I went to Catholic school at 23rd Montgomery. So that's right in the heart of North Philadelphia. So I remember the shops and the stores when I would catch the subway or the C-bus, I'm dating myself, the C-bus on Columbia Avenue at the time to go to 23rd and Montgomery. And it was a very different neighborhood. And then I'm going to kind of fast forward, and then we hit the crack epidemic, and I saw a complete shift in my neighborhood, because my neighborhood was a stable Black neighborhood. We weren't Mount Airy, but on the other side, we weren't in North Philly either, you know, so it's like we're stuck in the middle. And the crack epidemic hit hard in my neighborhood, and we saw generations eliminated through mass incarceration, drug addiction, just the destabilizing of the family. And then I went to Temple, and my ex family grew up at Asa Montgomery, right across from the gas company was there. It was a very middle neighborhood. It wasn't, you know, I'm almost uptown. If you know of Philly people, I'm almost in Mount Airy. It wasn't that, but it was a community. And now Temple has bought the housing development that was there. It's eliminated. Gentrification, I went down there like 2 weeks ago. I couldn't even figure out which block I was on. You had to follow the street signs because there's so much development in that area. And the question is like, where are the people that were here before? You know, and it's kind of sad because it's neighborhoods and families and communities just completely destabilized. And I think about housing stabilization versus tax abatement. And part of my story, pathway to politics, was that I lost my house because of tax liens. I had lost my job. I was unemployed for 2 years and lost everything. And one of the things was my house, but my family home because of back taxes. At the same time, when I realized that we're giving millions of dollars of tax abatement to rich people, why aren't we doing housing stabilization for neighborhoods that have been historically redlined? And it was like a wake-up call to me. So, like, that is what I see happening in cities, in neighborhoods across Philadelphia. South Philly is ground zero. We see it happening in West Philly, and now in my neighborhood, I'm seeing it again, you know, SEPTA doesn't put $1 billion in a train station in the middle of North Philly for no reason. You know, last week we opened up a brewery walking distance from my house. You know, our conversation is like, what does housing stabilization looks like for working class people, poor to working class people, because they exist. And you can see how it's just people are just being run over by systems. And, I'm in the fight to just stop it. It has to stop because you said it's genocide. Where are the people? Where are the communities? You know, you think about right here on this campus. When I watched the video and I thought about Drexel, when I dated back to when I used to go visit my friends that lived down the bottom. I was driving through there. I could not even remember what block her grandmother lived on because it doesn't look the same. Yeah, I'm having a moment. It's like memory lane.
These are very powerful stories. I grew up in Toronto, which is not in Philly. I can tell you Medicare for All works very well in Canada. I've lived here for a few years, and I live now in South Philly, and maybe I'll just say something about what I've learned with some of the quantitative research I've been involved with. And if it's not right, someone should correct me. One of the things we're really focusing on is how does climate change potentially exacerbate the inequalities that we have? And we think about something like eco-apartheid as the path that we're heading on. So let me give you one example to start. There's been discussion of the urban heat island effect, which I think some of you will know about. So the idea is that neighborhoods, especially they don't have trees, get really hot. So if you look at Philly, you take North or South Philly, both neighborhoods that have been historically redlined, and I live in South Philly. Take North and South Philly, in the hottest summer days right now, you have a difference of often over 15 degrees between those neighborhoods and very leafy neighborhoods, parts of West Philly, parts of Mount Airy. That's a huge difference. But the temperature on the street doesn't necessarily tell you everything about the temperature in the home. So what we're looking at is also, what is the burden of paying for electricity, which is how you cool your home, in different neighborhoods in Philly. And there is a very large difference. In South Philadelphia, people are paying less than 5% of their income in electricity. And in neighborhoods in North Philly, sometimes in the neighborhood of 20% of their income in electricity. And this means, right, that you're making a choice. Can I afford a new air conditioner? Can I turn on the air conditioner? And it turns out that in the Mid-Atlantic overall, about half of black families are facing energy insecurity. That means they got a utility shut-off notice in the last 6 months. They sacrificed on essentials like food to pay their utility bills, or they kept their home at an unsafe temperature. And that is very much something we can locate and place and see that there is a profound difference in the experience of climate change, right? And we now have something like 5 days a year at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. By 2050 in Philadelphia, that'll be 30 days a year. So what steps are we taking to make sure that there's not a heat emergency just in poor communities of color in Philadelphia, right? And I think right now we're not really taking serious steps. We could talk about sea level rise. This is another, it looks a bit different. South Philly up to like Oregon is going to be underwater. Airport, Lincoln Field, all that will be underwater. It could go up to South Street if we have 4 degrees Celsius warming, and we live in a state that's responsible for 1% of the carbon emissions because of a fracking industry that benefits a very small number of extremely rich people. And more broadly, I think when you raise this question, I think of genocide, which is right. Where are people going to go? If you look nationally, we're talking at something like 13 million people displaced by sea level rise alone, potentially maybe tens of millions more when you look at flooding. 5 million Americans almost live in fire risk right now. The Great Migration's emancipatory potential, I think a lot of us in sociology feel, the emancipatory potential of the Great Migration was really dampened by redlining, which deepened segregation and kind of calcified Jim Crow. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what are the housing policies that we need, new, green, affordable housing, so that the next Great Migration from climate change does not reproduce or cause eco-apartheid, but is instead truly emancipating. I think we need to think really ambitiously about what green and affordable and social justice housing policies would look like. So there is a good news story that I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more. But we have to face the facts. Climate change is not like an issue adjacent to inequality. It is going to turbocharge inequality to the benefit of the same people who benefited from all the other forms of inequality in wealth and in racism that we've seen so far. Climate change is more of the same unless we do something about it.
Thank you, everyone. I think your comments really segue well into our next question here. As we all know, advocates have put their heart into organizing and fighting for legislative reform against redlining and in other issues such as eviction, some of the issues that you mentioned, Rasheedah. Yet we're still facing a lot of the same problems. And in some cases, the issues have digressed. It doesn't seem we've been able to restructure the housing system and affordable housing initiatives in a way that's equitable and sufficient. What does that say about our ability or the ability of legislative reform to combat housing discrimination and provide affordable housing in an equitable way? And for us in the audience, and I guess moderating the panel, future lawyers and organizers and advocates, potentially even legislators, wanting to engage in this fight in a way that's going to move the needle and make an impact. What recommendations do you all have for us as we look to kind of step up to the mantle and try and positively impact these issues?
I'll start because I think they'll have better answers. If you wait till the end, then you look bad. So I'm going to jump in. I think truth-telling is helpful. I think part of the challenge, especially for you young, part of the challenge is sometimes we like to move forward in a direction to correct problems, but we don't quite have a full appreciation of how we got here. So we've been talking about redlining, there's racial covenants and, I have a PowerPoint, but that's okay. So I guess one of the ways to begin is to understand that where we are is intentional. I think we sometimes, it's de facto. It's just bad actors within the system, say real estate agents, say banks, or, and we haphazardly have come upon communities that have been disinvested. They happen to be black or brown communities. I think part of our way forward is to take an honest look back and say it was intentional that some communities thrived through the Homestead Act, 1860, in which 160 acre, not in Philadelphia, but 160 acres were given to those who would go west of the Mississippi, and only 3% of African American, 3% of non-whites were able to participate in that. We have to be clear in understanding that the New Deal was intentional in providing financial resources and restructuring of our government as it relates to home mortgages, which we all know now you can get 1530. Prior to that, it was a 7-year and it was a balloon payment. It's only the wealthy. So the government intentionally set up a system to create the middle class. Then depending where you are in the argument, it worked for many of you. But less than 2% of those who are able to participate that, because of exclusionary direct laws for African Americans and other people of color, we could not get into the system in order to build wealth. And when you think about housing, we got it, it's wealth gathering. And that's home equity, that's security for other type of loans, that's transference of wealth to the next generation. We as African Americans were not part of that system. And then lastly, through the VA bill, not the VA bill, the GI Bill, we have to be honest and say that created billions of dollars worth of not just education, but that was loans for former GIs like my father who served in the Korean War. But because he was African American and because of how the system was set up, he, amongst others of African Americans, could not get in there to get those resources that build most of the Northeast Philadelphia, Oxford Circle, where I pastored for 20 years. So a way forward is to be as intentional as we have been in setting this system up. We have to be just as intentional in deconstructing it and creating pathways that will involve public, legislative, in private ways would be my overall comment on that.
Okay, I've been depressing everybody, so I'm going to get optimistic now. We have to win, and we have to be bold. I'm very lucky to be part of a national campaign called the Homes Guarantee, run out of People's Action. And this campaign comes out of tenants organizing in Kansas City who've just won huge tenant protections at the end of 2019. And the tenant leaders saying, we're sick of fighting for like a little market nudge. We're sick of fighting for a little tweak. We need to get really bold. We need something, a vision that is comparable to Medicare for all, free college for everybody, free public colleges, tuition free, and so on. We need a really big, bold demand. The demand that we're talking about is the Homes Guarantee. And so very quickly, items like the bullet points on this, Green New Deal for housing, retrofits, green new social housing, 12 million units of green social housing in 10 years. Seems crazy. Ilhan Omar has already proposed it in legislation. We need to have reparations, direct investments in black and brown communities, cancellation of toxic loans, and we could go down the list, and you already helped us get started. National rent control. And rent control is essential for climate and environmental justice, because when you don't have rent control, what happens is that you have, like we saw in New York City, neighborhoods like Sunset Park, Williamsburg, Harlem, environmental justice organizations, finally, after years cleaning up neighborhoods that have been poisoned by government and private companies, and then that brings up the home values, and the people who would benefit the most get kicked out. Or public transit investments get made in neighborhoods, and the people who would benefit the most get kicked out because of rising costs, rising rents, and rising home values, property taxes, and so on. So rent control is essential for stabilizing neighborhoods and ensuring that environmental improvement does not cause gentrification and displacement, but simply improves the neighborhoods for the people who already live there. And by the way, that means you can then densify without a trade-off where people have to leave, right? But you have rent control stabilizes those neighborhoods. Now, I could go on and on about this Homes Guarantee agenda, and you would say, Professor Cohen or Daniel, hopefully, you're crazy, but I'm not crazy. This Homes Guarantee campaign, on September 5th of 2019, we put out at homesguarantee.com our platform. Everybody laughed. By the end of the month, it was already in the campaign platform of Bernard Sanders, who is currently, if you go to 538, the favorite to win the Democratic nomination, putting national rent control on the agenda. Yeah. Huge green homes guarantee. And if you look at places like New York, just yesterday, they banned brokerage fees in New York City. They banned brokerage fees. Last year, the tenant movement destroyed the Real Estate Board of New York. Just absolutely destroyed them with upstate, downstate organizing, took out the single most important business lobby in the city, got very aggressive rent regulations passed. The Real Estate Board of New York cannot believe it. They're still crying about it. You can go to their newsletter at Rebney. It's very fun. You're seeing tenant victories now all over the country, and we have to preserve and stabilize and enhance black and brown homeownership, but we also have to protect tenants, of course. And just the last thing I'll say quickly, the vision of green social housing could sound like science fiction in the United States, right? Are we really going to save affordable, public housing in Philadelphia with green retrofits? Well, we can. We absolutely can. All over the world, you're retrofitting social housing, cutting costs by 60%, massive improvements in the quality of living. I helped AOC and Bernie write the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. Just alone taking the mold out of New York City Housing Authority, for instance, that would reduce asthma rates by 20%. And if you look around the world, what is the most sophisticated architectural work being done now? It's green social housing. Last year in the United Kingdom, the Sterling Prize, National Architecture Prize, went for the construction of no-carbon public housing in Norwich, England. Beautiful development of no-carbon townhomes for working-class people. In Europe, the Mies van der Rohe Prize for Architecture. Mies van der Rohe, the most famous modernist architect of the 20th century. Mies van der Rohe Prize for Architecture went for a green retrofit of public housing in Bordeaux, France, that cut electricity costs by 60%, actually made the apartments bigger, swapped out all the appliances, made the indoor air much cleaner. This is like the cutting edge of the housing world right now, is affordable green housing. It is completely outrageous that we live in a part of the world where our elites make us feel like it's science fiction to dream about a thing that we can do that would massively improve life, massively help us in the struggle against climate change. That is a possibility that is right in front of us, and if we fight for it, we will win it.
So I'm coming from the perspective, I've been an organizer longer than I've been a politician. So when I think about this work, we think about building power. What does building power look like? So the question was, how can
we be most effective in this battle, essentially?
Right, so when I think of how can we be most effective in this battle, like most of us, or most of the people in this room are aware of these things that are happening. We work with the legality of things as well as systems. And when I think about buying a block, it's a real generic term from rap music. People understand what it means to buy the block. But if you don't understand how to buy the block, it eliminates and it keeps you in a constant cycle of poverty. So what we can do as part of building power is by organizing. We need to organize around the supports that we just put in place in the city around eviction. We need to organize around helping people understand historically what redlining means, and that the blight in our community is not because you don't care about building your property. We need to organize and making sure people have help understanding their taxes and what does it mean to lose your home, and figure out what it means to have tangled titles and deeds and wills that are unfulfilled. And that's how we can get to real legislative reform, because sometimes what I'm seeing, all of us understand systems and are willing to fight back. The people that are most affected are working 2 and 3 jobs and doing the best they can to get by. Sometimes they don't understand that the support is here. So each of us has a responsibility to make sure that this information is available and that people can navigate these systems. When I lost my house, I remember going to community legal services, and they were very helpful, and they gave me a lot of information, but some of my neighbors would not have been able to navigate that system alone. And in order for us to be able to help and stop this and build power, we must reach out to the folks that aren't connected to the knowledge and understanding that we have of these systems, and that's how we build power. We have to all do this together, whether you're a Penn lawyer or a homeless person trying to get a house back that the city has taken from you, from your family. We had to come together and make sure we're navigating these systems together, and that's how we all can help. It's about building power. Without real power, legislative reform is not possible.
Once again, I cannot improve upon my panelists. You were right about going last. That's fine. But yeah, no, I echo everything everyone said about the idea of intentional design. We got ourselves into well, I didn't, but somebody got us into this, right? And we have to socially engineer our way back out of it. I think, this idea of political will, being able to speak up, right? If we're not speaking up and talking and demanding things of our government, right, they're not going to have the will to do it. And I think, to that end, a lot of our work is being done in silos still. I think we're working towards all coming together more around and understanding the kind of comprehensive housing issues that are happening in our city, but we're still working in silos. We're still not talking to each other as much as we need to around all of the different things that are happening in our city. So, for example, what's happening in West Philly with the towers that PHA is trying to sell off, right? that's our community members. I might not live around there, but we need to know what's going on, and we need to know how that's connected to everything else that's happening in the city, and because that's not just an anomaly. That is happening everywhere around the city, and so we need to speak up in order for our government to have the will to address those specific issues and understand how they're all connected. And then the last thing I would say is just to reassess our notion of success, and that's just like interrelated to everything else that I just said. Like, this system was designed over hundreds of years. We're not going to dismantle it tomorrow. We're not going to dismantle it 10 years from now, unfortunately. And that's because while we're working to dismantle it, there's still massive inequities being created and happening. And so we have to understand that cycle and just reassess our notion of success. Understand that successes are actually happening, as you just talked about. People are making waves around the country, and these things are building momentum everywhere. So recognize that things are happening, recognize that tomorrow it's not going to be fixed, and that this is long-term, lifelong work for all of us to deal with. As long as we are living and breathing, we need to be engaging in this work and talking about this and doing what we can. So that's how I have come to feel hope in this work.
Thank all of you for those insights. We wanted to pivot a little bit to talk about eviction, so maybe we can start with you, Rasheedah, and anyone else can jump in. So lately in housing advocacy work around the city, we hear a lot of talk about how eviction most impacts women of color and Black women specifically, but some of the policies to combat it might seem facially neutral. So we were wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what we could do specifically to advocate for Black women and other women of color facing these issues in Philly, and how we can center them in the advocacy work so that they're at the forefront of advocating for these issues as well.
Sure. I think my answer is quite simple. When you help Black women, you help everybody. Because of the intersectional oppression that Black women experience and have experienced since we were forced to come to these shores, right? Or if we were here already as Native Americans, right? We experience the worst of the worst within these systems. And so when you are helping Black women, when you are fixing the system, creating equity for Black women, you're helping everybody. It flows down, it trickles sideways, it trickles up. So that's where I would start. I think with the Right to Counsel campaign, we very, very purposely and intentionally called out the thing that was happening. You couldn't ignore it. 70% of the people who were having eviction files against them were Black women. And if we're not naming that, we're not fixing anything. We're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So it was incumbent upon us to name that. And we were empowered to name that because we were seeing it happen around the country. And again, when you have the data, unfortunately, you can't deny what we already know. Like we can say anecdotally, Black women are impacted, but what moves people, unfortunately, is data. So once we had that information that said very starkly that 70% of the people being evicted are Black women and their children, right? You can't ignore that. And if you do ignore that, right, there's things that we can say about you ignoring that. We can say that you knew what was happening. We can point to your role, and when I say your, I'm talking about the city of Philadelphia and other government actors, right? We can point specifically to your role. We can point to the history, right? So you can't ignore all of that. And if you do, then, right, we can sue you or we can do other things. So that's what I would say about that. It was a very intentional campaign and a recognition that if we're not talking about the systemic issues, the systemic history here, how this came to be and who's most impacted, we're not fixing the problem.
I love what you just said, and I want to add one thing, and especially because we're in a room of lawyers or future lawyers, which is very exciting to me, obviously. A maligned profession, we got to lift it up. Right to counsel is great, and it is essential. At the same time, most people are evicted because they can't make rent, and you're not going to win a housing court with a lawyer if you can't make rent. So fundamentally, what we need to do is protect people from abusive landlords, and we need to provide non-market housing that people can afford. I mean, you have to put money in the pockets of Black women, obviously, right? We can talk the whole gamut from raising wages to welfare payments, Social Security payments, you name it. And you need non-market housing that people aren't going to get kicked out of. And one way we're talking about, for instance, doing that in Philly, and I'm working with Nikhil Saval, who's running for a state senate in central Philadelphia, Saval for all, as they say. We're talking about taking 25,000 vacant homes in Philadelphia, doing green rehabs and converting them into community land trust homes that could provide housing for 125,000 people in Philadelphia that they will not get evicted from. That's going to stabilize wealth in the community with homes that are permanently off the market. And yes, we have to get back into the construction of social housing. If private landlords are the gatekeepers of stability for low-income people of color, low-income women of color, black women, brown women, then yeah, their number one mission in life is not stabilizing the lives of their tenants. And so there is an alternative housing system that we can build, and we can start. It will take a very long time to finish, but it won't take very long to start. Like you said, with the organizing, we can get going right away.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Thank you all. I think this will kind of be our last question before we kick it over to Q&A. But many of the students here in the audience and throughout the University of Pennsylvania campus are new and transplants to Philadelphia. Oftentimes we observe the gentrification impact that we as students are having. Not necessarily a positive impact, and we want to get engaged and kind of help alleviate the problem rather than just observe it and talk about it. Any advice as to how we as students in transplants to Philadelphia can turn potential guilt associated with being a gentrifying presence into action that positively impacts the city?
Work for Kendra and donate to her campaigns.
That was part of my answer. You know, I want to start with see your neighbors. I think the number one thing that I hear from black and brown folks that live in communities that are going through gentrification is that they're not seen. I talked about walking through North Philly, which is now Templetown. Like, what happened? And my older neighbors that are still doing organizing work, they don't feel like they're seen. We think about young black men that grew up in that neighborhood, the same things that the college students are doing in front of the doors and on the blocks, they would be arrested for. So we're all responsible for that. And I think recognizing your privilege and doing what you can to support that community. And number one is just seeing it, not looking at it and judging. Seeing it means taking time to understand the historical nature of every community that you're in, because there is a base. And being a part of the community is just that. It doesn't mean bringing your suburban Northeast into the community and changing. That's not what you're there for. We're there to come together and create community, and it doesn't happen just by you bringing your privilege into a space and dictating what it looks like. So seeing a community means that. And then number two is we're always looking for researchers. We have a lot of work around housing that is happening. In order to win, it's about organizing. So part of organizing is using your gift. Everybody's not going to be knocking doors. We get that. Some folks, your gift could just be research and aligning support. So my director of legislation is here. If you're interested in getting involved in our office, we have so many different campaigns. And our number one right now is rent control is our campaign that we're pushing number one. So we need a lot of research to win that.
I would just echo this understanding of know the history of the community and what you're in, which I think many of the Penn students may be on a higher curve in that understanding. I think change the narrative. There's this false narrative that poor communities or historically underserved communities are that way because people are lazy, people are, and the list just goes on of that narrative. I think change the narrative. I think recognizing that poor communities or economically poor communities value development. What they don't value, or what we don't value, is displacement. I think the brother on the video talked about what would so-called University City, because I want to call it West Philly, but I get in trouble. But what would what we now call University City be? How would it be different, and how would it be even more alive if the Black Bottom, along with the educational facilities that are around here, work collaboratively together? I don't know, because it didn't happen. I think we have to have a vision of that possibility of development without displacement. I think we need to hold our political officials more accountable. As to Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, everyone gets excited about the end of it, but the first part of the speech, he really pushed about that the United States has given African Americans, but it could be a broader, African Americans a check that's been returned, NSF. And so how do we hold our political officials accountable to that as it relates to our communities? And then lastly, I think you got to use your influence and your networks. You come from communities and networks of influence, policymakers, public and private or private institutions, financial institutions. Those are networks that have a direct influence on communities such as North Philly, such as West Philly, Southwest Philly as well, would be my words.
I just want to state from our brother Barry that couldn't be here right now, but the PhillyTenantsUnion.org, that's a place where you can get involved in your community. We're about, actually not dependent on lawyers, not depending on anybody that's elected, which they will not save us, so we have to save us. It's about going to buildings, getting people organized, doing rent strikes, going to landlords, and demanding our rights. Those are the things that are going to save us to begin with. PhillyTenantsUnion.org. That is where you need to join their General Assembly meetings and other working groups that you can learn more about. So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have some note cards out in the audience and people are just taking a minute to write their questions down. While we're waiting for that,
Laura, can I?
Yes.
I have a PowerPoint on there, just the red line. I think it's a known observation, but we've been talking about redlining and more so its past impact. But perhaps it would be a helpful piece to the conversation just around how the redlining maps of the 1940s, 50s, if you look at it on my one of my PowerPoints, or any map of Philadelphia, keep going down, 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 right there. So this is the actual map of redlining, and for those, I think everyone is aware of redlining. It was utilized to back the insurance for the, if you keep pressing, all four of the categories will come up. There we go. If you look on the red line map, you can track in 2020 where gentrification is going to happen, or is happening in the red and the yellow. I'm not familiar with the Southwest and West Philly side. I'm more familiar with the North and the Northeast side. So I'll just comment on to my right, which would be to your right, I guess, as well, is where Brewery Town, someone mentioned Brewery Town, Fish Town, we're doing our work with our financial organization in Kensington. All those are potential targets for gentrification. And there was a study done, I'm not sure if it was Policy Map, but specifically in San Francisco, where 87% of what was formerly redlined is now being gentrified. And so from a city planning perspective, or big picture perspective, we already know where gentrification is going to happen. So it doesn't have to be this way, but this kind of gives us a path to think through strategically how we can work towards development without displacement. And there's some key factors around development within low, moderate income to maintain. Social services need to be available. Trying to think of some of the other things. Green space, banks and financial services, healthy food. Those are the things that keep LMI folk in the community over against pushing them out. So I just thought that's been an interesting learning for me in the last year. And you as lawyers and leaders can think about in Philadelphia. And I think this is pretty consistent nationally as well.
And I'll just throw in that on that map, so where you see the D grades, 60 out of 66 public housing sites were built within those D grade areas. Only 6 of those 66 sites fell outside of those areas. And what we're seeing now is exactly what you're saying. There's a risk that in the next 20 years, we're starting to see a loss of affordable housing in those same areas. So those public housing sites are now being, they've been disinvested over various years, and so they're now being sold off to private developers, or private developers who already have them are opting out of providing affordable housing, to the tune of, we'll see in the next 20 years, the possible loss of over 15,000 affordable housing units in these areas. So it is a really, it's exactly what you said. It's a repeat. We see history repeating itself with these things, and we really have to be conscious, because now is the time to intervene before we're right back where we were.
Great, thanks guys. I think we're going to move to the questions and answers now. And some of you still have note cards. Feel free to see Haley and she'll bring them up here. So I think the first question we're going to start with is talking about how in New York they have blamed militarized and publicized anti-gang enforcement actions by police and ICE for exacerbating gentrification. Has this phenomenon been seen in Philly too? Is the move bombing an example of this trend?
I'm not clear about, can you ask the question again?
The person who...
Elaborate, that was my question.
Oh.
I was just listening to a podcast recently that explained how massive raids against so-called gang territories in New York has made it harder for community members to remain in their homes when their family members are arrested, for example, like this breadwinner. I was wondering if these giant actions that take place in Philly, if that's something at all, some of the things we discussed.
Not that I'm aware of in terms of gangs specifically, but we do see a very close connection, of course, between police arrests, contact with the criminal justice system, and loss of housing. That's very clear. Specifically in places like public housing, where there's actual regulations against allowing people with certain kinds of criminal records to apply or to gain access to affordable housing, down to rules and lease agreements that require you as a landlord, even just based off an arrest, to try to enforce an eviction action. So we do see a very close linkage, of course, between criminal justice and housing, but I'm not familiar specifically with like gangs and what that issue looks like in parallel to what's happening in New York.
With your expert, I'm just curious, would that be not much different than Jim Crow laws, right? It's kind of vagrancy.
It's definitely tied into that. Yep, it's definitely, but it's a lot of it, at least recently, is connected to like the crack, the crack cocaine era, of course, and a lot of the arrests that were happening, and some changes in HUD regulations around those things around that time. But yes, it's certainly connected to that.
And then I want to add, when you said the crack epidemic, saying that, a large portion of black men were removed from the communities, which were also breadwinners, similar to that, not gang related, but just the war on drugs adversely affect families. And if you were caught in a home that, even if it wasn't belonging to you, it belonged to a family member, it was still taken into police custody, that you could not return that. So that's the only similarity that I would see, not gang related, but the war on drug adversely affects some of these areas that were hit really hard, causing housing destabilization for families.
And then we had another question from the audience about what lessons we can learn from the Moms for Housing moment in Oakland, and how the moms there were able to organize against developer and real estate speculation in Oakland. I'm wondering if we can think a little bit more about that, and maybe if there's a nexus between organizing that the mothers were doing in Oakland and the lawyering strategies to supplement that type of organizing.
Kendra, do you want to jump in? Because I know you had some familiarity with that story, or I saw you tweeting about it.
I think for me, it all goes back to organizing, and how can we do that same type of work here in Philadelphia? We have to get the message to the folks that are most affected, because they're not connected. And part of building that power is making sure that people are able to come together and share their stories and realize that they're not the only one. The strength in that strike and that action was that they did it collectively with the support with legal support, financial support from folks that weren't necessarily directly grounded. And sometimes we forget that it takes this and, because the physical, mental, and social-emotional sacrifice of those mothers aren't told. But the support that they needed between folks that are from lawyers and other community organizers to make that action fall in place, we can replicate that here, but it's really about coming together and seeing folks, because we have those same things happening right now. Rasheedah mentioned 46 and Market. People live there, and it's happening soon. So where are all these people going? We're getting ready to have a massive displacement in our city. It's bigger than just the houses going up for sale. Where are they going? So we have opportunities. We just need folks to organize and support.
And I'll just throw in that in my work, I consider myself a community lawyer, and I take that approach when working with community organizations, which centers, exactly as the council member said, it centers power building, it centers the community identifying and their own issues and identifying their own solutions, as opposed to a lawyer coming in and saying, this is what your problem is, this is how you fix it, right? So I take that approach when working with groups and have worked very closely with organizations like Philly Tenants Union and with their organizers to support their work, to provide technical assistance to their work, and to take that step back, and say, I don't have the answers. It's the folks who are impacted who have the answers, and how can I use my privilege as an attorney to support what they need to do and what they would like to do. So.
Thank you. Our next question, sorry, these are jumping around a bit. We have lots of different interests in the audience. Is about civil asset forfeiture, which was terrible for many reasons, but made a lot of money for people, for police in the city. How viable is a revenue neutral or revenue positive enforcement mechanism that penalizes landlords and developers who violate tenant and fair housing laws?
How viable is it, you asked?
Yes.
Well, it depends on enforcement, right? I think it's already viable. We do already have protections and laws in place that prevent discrimination and prevent retaliation or are meant to prevent those things or to punish landlords when they engage in those things. But if it's not enforced in the ways that it needs to be, it's just another law on the books. And if people aren't educated about it or don't have the means to access it or don't have the means to access assistance that can help them access those things and those protections, what's the point of it? So I think that's the key thing. We need to, as a city, understand how we better enforce these laws. As a community, understand how we demand that our city enforces these laws, and understand how we support our neighbors in accessing those spaces when they are facing discrimination and retaliation. And some of that goes back to what my co-panelists mentioned earlier about how we change this narrative, particularly around renters, right? And the stigma that comes along with a renter, that you're not as invested in your community, you're more unstable than homeowners in a community, and that really creates these kind of tensions and silos between homeowners and renters within one community. So when we can kind of change that narrative, right, especially as we become a city of primarily renters, right? We used to be a city of homeowners. 60% home ownership, 40% renters, and that has shifted dramatically in the last few years due to the mortgage foreclosure crisis and other things. And so we were at half and half a few months or years ago, and now I think it's more renters. So it necessitates a narrative change because more of us are renters, and we need to release that stigma so that we can help each other and sustain our communities together.
And I think for me, just like understanding enforcement, like I said, I've been an organizer longer than I've been a politician, and sitting in some of these rooms and we start talking about this whole underground housing market. And how can we dismantle that? Because we have to keep in mind a large majority of the folks that we're talking about, that's why the power of tenants union is so strong, are people that are sometimes renting through this underground market because of affordability. The average cost of rent in the city is like $800 some odd dollars. Some families making $725 an hour can't even afford $800 a month. But it's housing available, but it's substandard. And it's like a black market for housing, which continues this. And they still go through some of those other ways of removing people from homes with eviction, because before we didn't have attorneys going into court. So now with the new just cause evictions and the work that we're doing, hopefully it will be able to kind of push out this underground market and help for exposure, but we need folks to get involved because some folks don't know that they're a part of that underground market. So how can we continue to educate folks about this underground rental market and keep them from being exploited? And the majority of them are women that look like me.
And then the next question kind of tying into that and the conversations we've been having about organizing and lawyering at the local level, I also want to think about how the national government is also a part of that story. I know Professor Cohen knows a little bit about that. And how can we be organizing and lawyering at both levels that supplement each other?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, first I want to just emphasize again exactly what everybody has been saying, which is that the legal work really comes alive in concert with organizing. If you look at the most successful fair housing legislation, it's in New Jersey, the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which is very aggressive in terms of demanding that there be affordable housing for people of color built in every city, municipality in New Jersey. And they've had a lot of success, but where does that come from? In the 1970s, it comes from left-wing lawyers working with racial justice organizers, community justice organizers, labor unions. UAW had members who were coming up to New Jersey to work in car factories and couldn't get affordable housing in the communities with the factories, and so they had to commute from the Bronx. And you have people coming together all across New Jersey, joining with lawyers, winning a major Supreme Court victory, and then organizing nonstop all the way to the present to maintain these fair housing laws. So some of this national stuff is about local organizing in partnership, lawyers with other community, racial justice, labor union groups to get those laws enforced. The other thing, though, I would say is that we do face a landscape of conservative legal kind of hegemony. And so you have many decades ago, the beginning of the law and economics movement, which many of you may know about. Elizabeth Warren actually got her start there back when she was a Republican, which she's not anymore. But in the late 70s and early 80s, part of the whole Milton Friedman neoliberal revolution is about organizing lawyers to support free market economics. And now what you have is the law and political economy movement, which is a response from the left, and you can go to lpeblog.org if you want to check it out. And this is sort of thinking, okay, we're going to have to defend rent control in the courts. We're going to have to create a new political economic order to protect working families, something like a welfare state, a green welfare state, you name it. And so we need to have lawyers working on the ground, and you need to have lawyers who are in their, smoke-filled rooms, understand how the economy actually works, and not only learning about that from Wall Street. So I think lawyers really need to get plugged in to political economy. That is fundamentally one of the major organizing forces in our society. So there are many pathways to supporting the kinds of fights that we're talking about. And one of them is organizing, again, with a sophisticated concept of the economy, not from Wall Street, not from Milton Friedman, but from a much more progressive angle.
I would just interject, not so much focus on that question, but I want us also not lose sight of the value, not over against, because I think it's a both and, rental and affordable housing rental and home ownership. If we have to build wealth in our communities. Help isn't coming, right? So home ownership historically has been the number one way in which wealth is built. Not necessarily in that first generation, but that second and third generation are able to build upon it. And so the Fair Housing Act was in 1968. I'm here with a bunch of lawyers. You could tell me the date, time, and all that. But
April 4th.
I told you. But yet 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, the number was right around 40%. I have a slide somewhere on there. And we're still hovering right around that number, if not 39, 40% in 2016. So again, it's not one over against the other, but I don't want us to lose sight of, for Black and brown folk, wealth building is a way towards gaining power, along with community engagement and organizing. But the resources to do that isn't going to come, I don't think, at the level that it should, but it's not going to come from the federal government. It's probably going to have to come from within our own communities. Therefore, we have to have assets built up that we can then put our own dollars behind some of this activity that we're saying. For African Americans, about 40%. For white ownership is about 70%. That's a huge gap that we need to begin talking about strategic ways in building that home ownership as an asset tool.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've reached the end of our time. So I just want to thank all of our panelists again.